So if you could just introduce yourself to people who are listening to Forthright, and how you run your 75 doors, or how you've been running your 75 doors of affordable housing before it got to be untenable.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Keith Kelley. I'm a landlord here in Spokane, Washington, and I manage roughly 75 doors of affordable housing for tenants. The mission of my business for the last 16 years has been to provide high quality, affordable housing to great people. And I think the unique aspect of my model is that I rent out large single family homes by the bedroom. It's a much more management intensive process because effectively I'm not just managing a property, I'm managing a community of people who would otherwise be strangers more often than not. And so, working to provide a certain standard that, people are expected to adhere to, of being respectful of others, keeping common areas clean, that sort of thing. The advantage of this model is that an individual will pay anywhere probably between $400 and $600, depending on what sort of apartment one would be looking for, but a $400 to $600 saving versus apartment living. So it opens the door for more affordable housing options.
Right, and for some people, having that community, that kind of communal housing is a model that co-housing is a model that is very popular in some kind of circles and has some advantages because of a built-in community, but it is very different than just having apartments. Yeah. So when I first talked with you last spring, your frustration was with the eviction moratorium. And I know for a lot of landlords, that was a real problem because of if they had a tenant that was just taking advantage of it, I had a friend who knew he had a tenant that was able to pay, but just decided they weren't going to. People game any system that you put out there. Right. Tell a little bit about how that became a frustration for you and how that's developed over the summer.
Yeah, so it was a huge issue for me. There were, as you said, a number of tenants who were kind of gaming the system. Some who weren't, who for whatever reason were really struggling to pay any of their bills. The net impact on me, though, was a drop in over 30% of my expected monthly revenue. So it was quite frightening in that aspect. But the worst part about it for me clearly was the impact on the homes that I manage, where for the first time in my entire career as a landlord, I had never had any issues of domestic violence or anything of that nature. And within the span of about a 2-month period of time, probably had 5 or 6 different incidences, each at different homes, where individuals would get into a kind of a dangerous situation. And there were certain behaviors that would escalate oftentimes toward these situations. And I know I shared with you before, but it was when I had attempted to manage to these situations. I had one experience where the Attorney General's office for the state of Washington contacted me and effectively put me on ice, telling me that I'm not allowed to remove someone from one of my properties, even if they are a health or safety risk to others. So this situation throughout the moratorium was pretty harrowing. I had just constant phone calls and emails, text messages, everything from tenants every day, just talking about situations that needed to be fixed or resolved. And there were situations that I couldn't fix or resolve for them. And it was really stressful. It was hard to go to bed at night knowing the environment that existed in many of these properties, and the people that, I care a great deal for what they were experiencing and having to live with.
I had shared with you an email that David Sprecher sent to the city council. I've known him since he went to school with my daughter in high school for 12 years. So I mean, in school systems at Reardon for 12 years. So I've known him for a long time. He's a landlord. That is his business, and he owns a number of properties in Spokane, and he's the hands-on landlord, right? If you call somebody because the plumbing's out, it's David's going to show up to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave a very good description of what the problems are with the eviction moratorium. He had a good little note about, I'll just read a piece of it. Let's focus on helping tenants rather than shifting all the risk and burden onto the landlords, who will just have to pass along the increased cost and risk with higher rents, larger deposits, and much less flexibility on accepting marginal tenants. Quick note on marginal tenants: I regularly provide second chance rentals to applicants who have issues in their past that make them a much higher risk of not paying or not meeting lease requirements. I'm only able to do this when I have the confidence that I can remove them quickly if they don't meet the agreed expectations. Anything that makes it harder or takes longer to remove a tenant will result in landlords not being able to take a chance on marginal tenants, thus reducing access to rental housing for this group and likely resulting in higher rates of homelessness. And I think that's you are also a landlord who has taken some chances on tenants that probably wouldn't make it through a corporate checklist. But that means you need to be able to manage the risks that come with taking those marginal tenants.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Keith, you've had good connections with a lot of the city council and the local legislators.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been asked to serve on a number of affordable housing committees and task forces. I know it's been a passion of yours for a long, long time. But you've decided to get out of both the affordable housing business and to stop participating in those forums. And I heard the frustration in your voice when I heard you on another podcast. And that's a hard decision to pull the plug on something that you're really passionate about. Could you share a little bit about that story with us?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it has been really hard. I would, I qualify it as a vocational crisis because it really has been a real vocation for me, or a calling to be in this space of affordable housing. And I wouldn't say yet that I'm getting out of the business. I am selling my real estate progressively here over the next year, just because I no longer feel comfortable managing in this legislative environment here in Spokane, Washington. And I will likely be investing in other markets, but as a passive investor, not as an active one. What I may end up doing with my time after that, I don't really know, but I know that I carry about 16 years of experience in this industry, so to speak. And it is still incredibly important to me that we are solving for our community's needs. And I could certainly argue that this is our greatest need in our community right now is the need for affordable housing. And so I don't know. I mean, I could imagine stepping more into a nonprofit space to I don't know. I'm going to spend a couple months just doing a lot of reading and reflecting and figuring out what next. I know that I will carry this passion forward with me. I just don't know quite how to articulate, what my energy will be committed to, or how it will be committed in the future.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you and David both share was that you've sent messages to the city council and not had responses, not felt there was response. And you've mentioned that you had data you had of what works, because I think when you get to there's a lot of political partisanship, but if you can just get people to focus on, can we find out what works? You'd
Mhm.
think that would be where we could find common ground, but you were having trouble carrying that forward. And, perhaps after this, you could send me some of that stuff that works. I'd be happy to highlight it in a
Sure.
column. But what are some of the things that you have read, that you've studied, that do work, that we could maybe bring to people's attention?
Yeah, it's, I think for one, I don't know quite how to characterize it other than landlords seem to be um, thought of as, money hungry,
Snidely
evil.
whiplash. You
Yeah.
must pay the rent. You must. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I forget. Well, in any event, a lot of the policies, the public policies that come out are kind of responsive to that assumption. And they're also responsive to symptoms of our problem, but not the core problem. I define the core problem as one of an imbalance of supply and demand in the housing market, where if we have increased supply, then naturally that's going to put downward pressure on the cost of home ownership or the cost of renting. If we have decreased supply, then, like in the situation we're in now, demand for housing goes up, and with that go the costs of renting and home ownership. There was an article in the Journal of Business stating that prior to COVID, we had a shortage of housing in the amount of 32,000 housing units, which is already a pretty bad disparity between supply and demand. And then during COVID and all the regulations that came out throughout, there was a large migration of folks from other markets into Spokane, exacerbating our supply demand crisis. And in that environment, we have seen rents go up over 30% in the span of 1 year. We've seen, I think, multiple years now of property values going up about that amount.
And property taxes raising along with it. And that's,
yes, yeah, for sure. So housing affordability continues to be a huge issue. Our legislators recognize that, and they're responding to that, but they're doing so in ways that make life a lot more difficult for landlords. And ultimately, as some of these studies that I'll share with you point out, is the more that we have government regulations, the more negative impact it has on housing supply, on investment in housing quality and standards, and so forth. And so, yeah, I'm just reading through some notes here, but yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. There was a Sightline study that I saw. I think I looked at it last year, but it was looking at what were the cost drivers for housing, whether it was built by a nonprofit or a for-profit, whoever was building it. And they had quite a list of all the impacts that come from regulatory requirements. Every one of them with a good idea behind it, but the incremental burden,
right,
it goes over the tipping point.
Right. Yeah, and it's things such as zoning regulations, the building permit process, and then, of course, landlord-tenant laws like rent control, or one that has been called Ban the Box, which talks about restricting access to information on the tenant screening process. So landlords get less of a look, so to speak, into the criminal history of tenants who may be moving into one of their properties. Legal costs being assigned more and more to landlords, moving costs also being assigned to landlords. So if a tenant is evicted for violating the terms of the contract, not only is the landlord going to be responsible for all the legal costs associated with that process, but it's also being proposed, and I'm not sure where it's at in the process anymore, but that landlords would also have to pay moving costs as well. So when you stack these things up in a situation where, a tenant is not paying rent, likely causing damage to a property, and then you have a process of evicting someone who is not complying in good faith with the contract that they signed in the first place, it just creates such massive variables that can't be predicted for landlords in terms of what their carrying costs are going to be, and can they charge enough rent to cover these carrying costs. Whereas in a pre-COVID legislative environment, it was easier for me to anticipate that I would be able to effectively manage my properties in a state that has one of the more generous landlord-tenant laws as it's read for tenants. I mean, it's very friendly here in the state of Washington, but I was still able to pretty effectively manage my properties. I shared with you, I believe I shared with you one story of a tenant whose gross impact on me financially was greater than $20,000. And that's
right.
one tenant at one property. And so it's no wonder that when these policies go in, that investors, whether they're local investors or not, are going to choose to take their investment or their capacity to invest elsewhere. And what does that leave us here in Spokane? Well, there are fewer people providing solutions in the housing market for quality, affordable rental housing. So
yeah, and I don't want to be jumping on corporations just because let's bash corporations that invest in and provide housing and rentals. But the characteristic of any bureaucracy, whether it's private or public, because public housing can operate the same way, is they will stick to the rules. They won't sit down like you or David might with somebody and say, okay, so I see you had this problem. What's going to be different this time? How can we make this work? There isn't a person low enough down in a bureaucracy who has the authority to listen to human stories and make exceptions. And that's what I see as the saddest thing about a tendency to push everything into bigger and bigger management, is that you get less and less human touch.
Yeah.
I know when the house that we're currently living in anyway, that's a long story. I had a house to rent for a while. And my strategy, knowing how iffy it could be, and it's tough to be a one property landlord. But my son-in-law's in the Air Force, and I know how to get somebody who's in the Air Force, get their attention through their first sergeant if I have to. So I only advertised at Fairchild Air Force Base because we're just west of there. Figured I get somebody who's in the service. I know that they have a chain of command that can get their attention if they don't pay the rent or whatever they're messing up with. And I had a wonderful tenant who worked at Fairchild, but not everybody can do that.
That's true. Yeah.
Oh, well, Keith, I know that I actually did get a note back from one council person when I sent a link to another podcast that you had interviewed on to the council, to the whole council. Got a note back from one council member who said, hey, it will be we can't afford to lose Keith Kelley. I don't know if you've had any contact from any council members or not.
No, and I bet I could predict who that individual was. I mean, I have positive relationships with most on our council, but yeah, it's been pretty quiet, and that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. They've been, I'd say one in particular has been particularly responsive to my concerns. 3 joined me on a Zoom call with our state legislators, and I would say the silence from them has been a little bit more deafening in response to some of the concerns that I had been bringing forward for a while. And I thought it was only because of my relationship with some of our local city council representatives that they even gave me that airtime in the first place. It helped elevate my voice a little bit to have them kind of stand with me in that call. which I really appreciated.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's been an easier experience working with our city council representatives by and large. The committee work has been pretty challenging, just in terms of the dynamic that has been created in those meeting spaces, where I guess among other things, divergent perspective really isn't welcomed. There are some people who are applying bully tactics to advance
Mhm.
their own ideas, and I've shared that with our city council representatives, and had one respond, and anyways, it's just been
Yeah. I'm working with Spokane Talks Media. We're working on a forum that we're calling Beyond Politics in January. We have a sponsor for it. We want to design a resolved question. We'll have two, I'll be one facilitator, but we'll have a Leans Blue facilitator as well, so that we're trying to make sure we're divergent voices across the board, to have a conversation about governance, and to try to, as part of that, have a debate on an issue. And also we have to make it normal that we can have divergent voices at the table, and we're not going to agree, but we have to keep digging until we find a common ground and agreement on something that works before we can go forward. So I may invite you to be part of that. We'll have to see what the resolved question is first. If it's housing, I'll be sure and get a hold of you.
And that's the thing that's great about research, and not that research can't be manipulated or selectively chosen, but it reduces the conversation to a more academic framework, rather than one charged with emotion and, in some cases, uninformed ideas. And that was really my hope, was to get us beyond a point where we were saying, well, they're doing it in Seattle or Sacramento, so let's do it here. We need to elevate our dialogue on these policies, looking at the consequences, intended, unintended, and make our decisions from a more informed place. And that's really what our community expects of us when we're volunteering on these committees and on these task forces. I would hope that by and large people would want to have informed voices sitting at the table, sharing their ideas, and that this collection of individuals can, advance an idea that helps our community in some way. That's kind of the point of the process.
Yeah, you always need to have enough people at the table who will ask the questions that nobody else is asking, because they come from a different perspective. And that viewpoint diversity we're really missing that in a lot of our problem solving right now at every level. There's
so much fixation on who is at the table, and I think that's where a lot of the manipulation takes place. You look at the membership on these committees, what groups are represented, and what proportion are, different groups represented. These committees get to be pretty stacked to a point where it does become, more or less a bully pulpit. And that's kind of how it got for me, where, it was a fruitless endeavor to try to, bring this research to the table and discuss these ideas. Right. And then by being there as and feeling a little bit like a token, you can feel a little manipulated as well. And that's not a good place to be. Right. So, but I'd like to start on I'd like to end on something a little more positive. Let's hope that we can, in 2022, let's all make viewpoint diversity. Let's, listening to people you don't usually talk to, and everybody, every level, red and blue, whatever. We all got to talk and listen to each other. Yeah, I think that's a really good hope. There's one of my favorite quotes is, everyone is going through something nothing about. Be kind, be kind. And not to say that we've lost that, but I think we can be reminded of the importance of being kind to one another and having enough respect for one another for our differences. And so
It's a good closing quote, Keith. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
I appreciate you bringing this this topic forward to your audience.